PowerPoint. We haven't got much time, we've got 45 minutes. There's actually a few slides on another PowerPoint monitor. Before we start, my name's Russ. I'm the only one here. Just been in. I've been teaching in China for 13 years and coaching play teams for 10 and in BWDA style since 2010. Currently at Beihang Worlds where it's a lot cooler than it is here, but never here. So I'm going to do a few things because you're the advanced group, so it's not just going to be the elemental stuff that you should already know. I've seen some of you debate practices already. You know the basic stuff, but we'll take it to a higher level. So there's a bit of a mix of OG, OO, and then towards the end I'll do a quick PowerPoint of OO strategies, and if you want the PowerPoints, by all means free, so you can get them later if you think they're useful. So some of what I'm going to be talking about is here on the slide now, not panicking if you're OG, even if it's a motion you know nothing about, which people will talk about in a couple of days. Obviously, you have to identify a problem, especially in a policy debate. Identify the problem, establish that there's a need for change, it's absolutely vital, many teams don't do it, and then actually produce some kind of policy. Yesterday, in the practice debate, although it was beginner level, there was no policy, there was no MBD, there was nothing, it was, but you got to balance it, you won't do that. If it's values debate, what's the criteria, what's the yardstick, what's the comparison, everything's got to be clear. The Prime Minister is always going to get some sort of blame if things are not clearly set up. However, it's also the leader of the opposition's fault, and I'll talk about that later on this morning. If the PM doesn't set it up clearly, it doesn't give a criteria, narrows down too much, and it isn't going to be a better debate, the LO must say something about it. Doesn't challenge the definition, but makes a comparative analytical comment about what has been going on. As you get more advanced, as you get more experience, you need to think sometimes as a judge. And when you make the job easy for the judges, you get more credit. Obviously, managing your time, important. Because you're advanced, we want to talk about principles, stakeholders, and obviously how you submit the argument. So adjudicators will give credit to OG as long as your arguments, your essential arguments, are lasting throughout the debate. And then you're going to be more likely to be in the top two rather than the bottom two. Anybody who has clarity for the better debate will get rewarded. We always want clear framing from the OG, and sometimes we just don't get it. Even in the demonstration debate for the China round robin, there was some framing. It became clearer on the second speech rather than the first speech. So it's important that the Prime Minister remembers not just to set it up for their own team, but it's a better debate for the whole room, for all four teams. Make it clear, don't run away from important issues, you're going to get more credit. Hardline cases will always get more credit from the judges because hardline arguments, first of all, they're more likely to last. Big debate is interesting when it's controversial. So don't be scared of running away from an important issue, even if you don't really fully understand it. Engage with the issue, forcing OO to engage with your points will get you a higher rank. Clear framing. So even when you're not that confident what the hell you're talking about, debate performance. So pretend that you're confident even if you're not. Pretend that this is the best argument that's ever been thought of, even if it isn't. So when I say think as though you're a judge, but don't be sceptical of your own argument like you're a judge. This is why in the West, some of the best politicians started in debate at university. Tony Blair being a very good example, world-class liar. There's no better liar in politics than Tony Blair, former Prime Minister of Britain. So performance, be confident, appear knowledgeable, so that if there are any misunderstandings, let OOCO deal with misunderstanding. Force them to have to deal with something, rather than you go soft on it and talk around it and weaken your own position. That bottom point there, about likely situations and scenarios, it seems to me, even with experienced debaters in China, and I have been in China for a few years, like I said, sometimes the evidence isn't really stuff you actually know in real life. This has been happening this week so far. Because you're so concerned sometimes with principle and actually setting up a debate with your OG that you forget about a real life tangible example. You've left it all abstract up in the air. And there's nothing wrong with having a complicated setup with dealing with principle, even from Prime Minister's speech. But bring it down with something that can actually help people to visualise the stuff that you're actually talking about. So don't forget evidence, it's really important. We want to ground the debate, don't just let it be abstract like I just said, so bring it down to ground level so everybody can get it. So even if you're missing the real issue that the adjudicators think it should be, it doesn't actually matter. Because the debate itself is whatever the OG, whatever the Prime Minister says it should do on the definition. If it is a little bit missing the point, your problem will be with lower houses. They will reframe it to the extension. So you don't want to miss the point. But if you do miss the point, but you give an adequate framing for the way you've understood it, the interpreted it, defined it, that could be okay. That could be a hardline case. It could still work. But as I've already said, the better debate standard should never be forgotten. Better debate not just for your team, but OG, but for everybody in the room. It has to be fair. So this is advanced, but if you set it up and you cannot think how the opposition would respond to you, that's an unfair definition. We don't really want to hear it. Especially if you are against other good teams and you know they are good teams, they're going to make comments about your definition. They're going to say how narrow it was, and then you are not going to be above it. You'll be below them. And then you're relying on extension, closing house needs to be not as good as you. In which case, you don't come first or second because you were good, you come first or second because the other teams were worse than you. Don't rely on that as a strategy. Although it does happen. So, I've already said this, policy debate, what is the need? And if you don't deal with the necessity, it's going to be very weak. Just try to make it realistic. I've already said that, there's no problem. What is the best solution to the problem? Not just any solution, the best solution. And you have to sell it. And I think that's a little bit weak, what I've been hearing, especially in the last few months, even at the Nationals and the FLTRP final. The solution the PL is introducing is the best solution imaginable, better than anything else anybody could ever think of. And you have to sell that idea. In Tuna's first speech at the beginning of this tournament, to the opening ceremony, he was talking about how debaters end up in very good positions and very good jobs. Part of it is this idea of whatever you're coming out with, you can persuade people is the best idea ever. And you can try to sell that here. It looks like advertisers. You know, they tell you lies all the time, convincing you to buy things you don't even need, but they convince you that you actually do need them. You don't know you need them, you think you just want them, but you spend your money anyway. That's a persuasive skill. It's the same thing in debate. Why is this argument the best argument? And then the linking problem, even with advanced debaters, there's always a linking problem. So the link, what is the evidence linking to your assertion, with explanation, reasoning, link that to your team stats, which you have made absolutely clear in the first speaker's opening remarks, in the first minute or two of the speech, and never forget to link it back to the wording of the motion. In my opinion, again from my experience, CO wins debates more than any other team. They like to win 30% of the time. And I've seen CO win a lot of times because they go back to the wording more than the opening house teams. So we've got an idea and it becomes a little bit soft, a little bit vague, and doesn't deal exactly with the wording in the motion. So do that in upper house and preempt lower houses from being able to do that. They've had more time, so they're more likely to be able to do that. But remember that you're also competing against your team on your bench, the lower house of the For values debates, you need criteria, so it's not just better than, you have to explain why it's better than, what's more important than, you have to explain why it is important, and give us some yardsticks, some criteria to be able to measure why it's important, how it's important, how much more important it is. In values debates in China, I very rarely hear any criteria being really set up about how do we actually judge this, how can we evaluate it, and why your evaluations are the best evaluations for the debate. And then also with criteria, examples going back to the status quo. So different kinds of criteria, it could be about costs, it could be about short-term versus long-term effects, what's viable, what's doable, or an alternative, economic benefits, bad consequences versus good consequences, or vice versa. The moral issues, as which I heard an awful lot yesterday afternoon in the legalised prostitution debate, they're okay, but they should never be the main one, because morality and legality, they're not exactly synonymous. There are different kinds of morality in different situations, so don't make that be your first major point. Happier outcomes, good consequences rather than bad. There are many, many more. These are just a few ideas to start you off with. For policy debate, you need an MOD. Hopefully you know this already. The model, your idea. What are you going to do? Why are you going to do it? And hopefully you already know this as well, that when you are constructing your argument in preparation time, whenever you think you've finished, ask the why question. And if you don't ask the why question, it's going to be under-explained. Even if it's a good point, it's under-explained, it's not going to stand very long in the round. So what are you going to do and why are you going to do it? The agency, who's going to be in charge of this? Why are they the best people to be in charge of this? This doesn't need so much time, but it should be dealt with. And the delivery, how it's going to be done and why that way of doing it is the best way in the round. Again, you don't have to go into massive amounts of detail if you are OG, you only have 15 minutes. But if you've got the N, A, and D, again, your argument will stand longer because we're going to have to deal with those aspects. If you barely mention them, they won't have to. And if you make them significant enough and they don't, then you're going to be above them in the ranking normally. So you can't just think of a solution to the problem, it's got to be the best solution, the most practical, the most effective, the ones with the best consequences, the ones with the best benefits, and they need to be explained. It's not part of this, but just in my experience in China again, a lot of people have some really good ideas, but they don't explain them sufficiently. And then you're hoping the adjudicator will understand what you actually meant, even though you didn't say it. And I think, from what I understand, I think that's probably okay when you're speaking Chinese. You know, if a Chinese politician gives a speech and he quotes somebody, or he just introduces a line of poetry like what Zhao Bao used to like to do at the NPC meetings, but he doesn't tell you who said it, you're supposed to know that. But he doesn't tell you what he meant when he said it, you're supposed to know that in Chinese, and if you don't know, you're stupid, right? But in Britain, in the English language, if you're going to quote anybody, and you actually use the words they said, you tell us who said them, you tell them the effect of the words, and how important those words were in a particular context. So everything is explained, so everybody will get it. So some of you possibly, like this is very common, you get a lower ranking in the round and you say, oh, it's a stupid adjudicator. And that might be true, I might agree with that, because we're not geniuses, we're ordinary people with slightly more average intelligence. But if you let us be stupid, that's your fault, because you didn't explain it. English is a speaker responsible language. You have to make it easier, clearer for the listeners, including the judges. So for policy debates, OGs are expected to use MAD. We want to hear it, we want to hear it developed sufficiently. Answering those why questions. And when you finish all of the whys, the final question, so what? Why is your MAD so significant? why is it the best policy. Once you start on assertion, reasoning and evidence, make sure that we, as adjudicators, explicitly being told why the evidence you provide actually proves your point, the link. You don't want to be at the end of the round hearing, you have some really good ideas, but there's a lack of linkage. So you want to skip through the reasoning, you want to skip through the explanations, don't. When you think you've explained enough, explain again, add an extra sentence or two. It will never do you any harm, in my opinion. To make your ideas clearer is valuable. Yeah. And don't just listen and tell, you actually have to prove. So you need some evidence. There are good evidence, there's bad evidence, but just any kind of evidence is better than none. No evidence means no argument. It means you just have this assertion. Remember to link your evidence back to your solution, back to your team stance, back to where you put motion. Always reason, always explain. Somewhere at the beginning of the speech, PM or LO, we want explicitly, the adjudicators want to hear explicitly how things are going to work, why the principle is going to solve the problem. Don't forget solvents. It's easily skipped over for some reason. But if you need to identify a problem that needs solving, then tell us explicitly how that's actually going to work. It's to your advantage. Okay? This is the key thing, I think, in BP debate. For good teams, it's supposed to be, BP debate is supposed to be about principle. But as you're learning, when you have not quite enough experience, most of the principal ideas are left to lower house. Because they are expected, lower houses are expected to use them even more than upper house. But if you've already developed them a little bit in the upper house, or hopefully a little bit more than a little bit, then you're going to make it much harder for the second team to extend on principle. You're going to make them work harder at least. And if they can't work harder to find a better principle, and they're just going to repeat your principle, then you're going to be ranked above them. So don't ignore it, it's important. Principle-based arguments is what we want in BP debate. It also means that you can dominate the narrative with language, which I'll come to in a minute, as well as with the idea of the principle, which means your argument, your stance is going to last longer in the round. You're going to be first or second. If the PM does it really well, and the DPM echoes it, it's consistent. Again, by experience, that's normally first. Again, for clarity, give your bloody arguments a name. I don't care how many arguments there are as far as number is concerned, but I want to know what they are. So just in English, any kind of English speech, I want to hear the name 3 times. I want the PM to tell me we have 3 arguments, but name them, or 2 arguments, name 2's better than 3. But name them, blah and blah. And then come back, so number 1, blah, develop it, explain it, prove it. Second argument, blah, develop it, explain it, extend, explain. When they come to the summary, you just say the names. What tends to happen is, in the summary, especially if you finish a little bit early, the summary is just repetition of stuff I've actually heard, and you don't actually take it anywhere further. So all of the central part of the speech is spending 2.5, maybe 2.5, 3 minutes on each argument going into detail. And especially, as I've said, when the explanations quite often are actually under-explained, when you think you've finished, just have a reminder to yourself or from your teammate. Just give another sentence or 2, just to make that absolutely clear. So principle, keep asking fundamental questions about why we should be doing this, what the effect would be, why this is better than another thing. Some of you already know about principles, but don't just be using the principle you know if you can't make it relevant. And you don't need necessarily to have the names of principles, or although this is better. I have heard debaters talking about principle without using the word, by just asking themselves questions about what's important in the round, and why their argument should work better than another argument, they talk around the point, but they basically explain it without having a proper vocabulary. This is good. If you have the proper vocabulary, that is better. But at least have something. Explain the principle, you're in the top two. Or you're confident. Yeah, because you're advanced, so you want to be a little bit clearer on the language you're using as well. And hopefully you should already know a little bit about this. Choice of words, choice of language you're using, if the only opposition are just using the same words you're using, you're dominating the narrative. And the judges might be in favour of you without even realising that it's just about vocabulary. So in that debate about this has to be terrorism is justifiable, OG is talking, will not necessarily be using the word terrorist. Because terrorist obviously is a pejorative, negative term. And if you're in favour of what people are doing, even though it's illegal, and outside observers think it's a terrible thing, you would be calling them freedom fighters, and then the open opposition will talk about them in the negative. So, are they terrorists, are they murderers, or are they freedom fighters? Is it injustice or is it a criminal act? Do you have no choice to do something because of poverty, or what you're doing creates horrific scenarios? It's very, very, it becomes nuanced in the debate. And there should be a response from the other team. But for that to happen, the open opposition to say, well, they were just talking about freedom fighters and freedom lovers, but we understand these are criminal acts by terrorists. To be able for that to happen, you have to listen to what's being said. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But what tends to happen too much, if you over-prepare in opposition, you do not engage with OG because you weren't really listening to what they were saying, and you use your prepared arguments. There's no engagement, there's selective and not very important rebuttal. You end up with a parallel debate, and the adjudicators will want to kill over. It makes it very, very boring. You should already know the criteria for judging. We want engagement, we want significant contribution in the debate, in the round. Who advanced the biggest contribution to the round, and Rolf Fulks, the last one, is the least important. Engagement and contribution, they go together. So make sure that you are doing it, and make sure that the engagement is explicit, and then you'll be okay. Open opposition should not be using the same language as opening government. Remember those aspects of argument building, other than what you were taught the other day, but there's logic involved in logos. Pathos is the emotional, or emotions, not massively most important, but shouldn't be ignored. And ethos, ethical. So if you've got ethical aspects to your argument, it's more credible. And therefore, it's more credible, more believable, it can be more persuasive.
Can I ask a question about OG should not use the terms OG uses? By terms, you mean that the terms in their arguments, or in their...
I mean the actual language they're using. So if they're talking about freedom fighters, you don't call them freedom fighters, you call them terrorists. So there should be a clash on something as easy as language, actually. Open government, as we've already said, should set the debate by actually building a story, a narrative. If you can dominate a narrative, you can dominate around in another way, not just on principle, not just on argument. But the examples will help that with a strong hardline case. Yoa will challenge that narrative. You can tell the same story with completely different words, and it has a different effect. So, what should the OO do? This is what I think is really lacking quite often in BPP debate, not just in China, I've been told it's elsewhere as well. Obviously, I think you should have learned by now, or been told by now, you do not challenge the definition. Because if you do, you end up with a parallel debate, it gets really, really, really boring. It's not interesting. So you don't say that their definition was wrong and we're going to define it this way, don't do that. What you do is you comment on the weaknesses of their definition. It was self-serving. They narrowed down just for the benefit of their own team. And Mr. Speaker, we don't think that's fair within the context of British Parliamentary Debate. We know what they're doing, but we'll take them on anyway, because we still think they're wrong. And once you've done that, I've only heard it in China once, but when you do that, and you will hear it more often if you watch debates on YouTube, for example. Once you've done that, it's going to be very hard for OG to be above OG. But if you don't make that critical comment, which should come at the beginning of everybody's speech in the round, actually, that comparative analysis comment, if you don't do that, OG can do something really unfair, and you better go get away with it. And that's what I was saying earlier. All debaters with some experience should be thinking as a whip, and also thinking as a judge. So the beginning of every speech, it could even happen in the PM speech, but it's a bit more difficult. After that, every speech should start with a comment about what the previous team has just done, and how you are going to oppose that in your position with your team stance. A narrative comment, a critical comment, helps the judges see how much you understand the issues in the round. You're giving comparative analysis, which makes our job easier, and it makes for a better debate. And the team that makes it a better debate gets a higher rank. If you're all doing it, it just makes it a much, much better debate. But in my experience, one team does it, nobody else does it. Yes.
Yeah, I would ask that if the Prime Minister she said a definition that is just to one group of people, but you have prepared your arguments for several group of people, should you abandon all your arguments?
Yes, basically, and that's what lots of debaters don't like to do. So if you over-prepare your own what the LO is going to say, and basically what happens is you don't even listen to what the LO is saying anyway, because you're looking at your own notes, then you're going to be in trouble. So sometimes, yeah, even though you don't like it, sometimes the debate's been set up in a way that you weren't expecting. You have to listen. Was it still fair? If it was fair for everybody in the debate, if it was fair as a debate for 4 teams in the round, then you have to deal with it. If it was too narrow and only fair for the OG, and you make a comment on it, then you can continue with your prepared arguments. But if you make no comment at all, and you just carry on with your prepared comments, then there's no engagement, then you are going to be penalised when it comes to the marking in the judges' discussions. So don't challenge the definition, but make a comment on it, and if you can, you extend it, or you talk about the weaknesses of the definition before carrying on with your own points. O's do not need an alternative model. Sometimes it can be beneficial, but you don't always need it at all. I've seen quite a few rounds where OG were the favourite team, and they came up with some really good ideas, and all LO did was rebut and defend the status quo. That's enough, or it can be enough. But remember, obviously you know this as well, there's no one rule that will always apply to every single debate, every single tournament. You have to be flexible. You should split the arguments between PM and DPM. You should be preparing together. Both speakers prepare at least some of the time together. So there is agreement and we have a team line. And the PM should make that clear what the team line is actually going to be. Don't just say at the end of your speech, and the deputy will give you some more arguments. I want to know which 2 or 3 arguments the PM is going to cover and what argument the DPM is going to cover. You don't need a whole list of many arguments, but it needs to be clear who's going to cover what. Judges want to know. The only thing there is if you say your deputy is going to cover something and then they don't, or we noted it down, then you're going to be in trouble. But it's even better if the PM said the deputy was going to cover something, the deputy doesn't, then I want somebody in the opening opposition to say, but they said they were going to cover the social aspect. We didn't hear it. That should be the beginning of the DLO speech. So you're indicating to the judges that you are awake, that you are engaged, and you're giving critical comment on what they didn't do that they said they were going to do. Again, it's that critical comparative analysis. The debaters, when they give it, it's to their advantage. What did I just say? Yeah, so principles, you team split the arguments, have a team line, be consistent, don't forget about principle. The Prime Minister probably often won't have enough time to develop the principle argument themselves. Sometimes it takes a long time to set up a debate. But they can indicate what the principle is that they want to be talking about in the team line. The deputy can develop it further. That's not the violent strategy. Don't have too many arguments in the Prime Minister's speech because you don't have time to develop them. And don't give just lots and lots of assertions with no argument. They've got to be copied with no argument. Strongest argument should be first. Quite often, even with advanced teams in China, I hear the best argument coming, the last argument from the second speaker. It's unfair because you've got to give the other teams a chance to actually respond to it. So put the first one out there. Be brave, develop it, you'll get credit for the bravery. So who's going to go with which arguments? Needs to be clearly stated to the adjudicators. Otherwise, the second speakers are just repeating what the first speakers had said. Unless you're brilliant and you can think of a new idea while you're listening to the other speeches and trying to POI at the same time, you have to multitask. If you've got some idea of a team line before and a case split before the PM has actually started, you're more likely still to be coming up with new ideas, something new in the second speaker's speech. No development from the second speaker is weak and will be noticed. And we mark as a team, you get a team ranking. So if the PM's really, really good, but the DPM just repeats what the PM said, when it comes to speaker voice, the PM gets a really high score, the DPM doesn't. And then it's going to be hard to be the first ranked team unless the other teams were weak. So sometimes you win a debate, you get first ranking, not because you were good, but because you were least bad. But you don't want that. Because you want to know that you're covering the things we're talking about, so you will gain confidence as much as anything else. And if you're gaining confidence, then it's easier to appear confident when you're making speeches. That's how you make progression. It's not about whether you won or not, or whatever position you've got, it's why you got it. That's why judges' feedback is really, really important. And you'll judge for yourself whether the judges' feedback is useful or not. And if they don't know what they're talking about, don't listen to them.
So, as a deputy prime minister, should she give examples of extensions to prime minister's documents first, or with her review arguments?
A bit of both. Depending on what the LO did, the DPM has to rebuild. So if something was weakened by the LO, and you want it to be the most important argument, then there has to be some rebuilding, and maybe some new evidence will actually help with that. But you still need something new. You still need to develop the case study, the team line. So you need not just to repeat, you need to take it further. So yes, a lot of most time on the most vital argument. Be careful with the timing, because I heard it yesterday where there was going to be 3 arguments, but I never heard the third argument, because she took too many POIs on the first argument and she just ran out of time altogether. So you've got to learn how to judge it. Sometimes in training, it might be useful if your partner's actually helping you with timing, giving you signals. I saw this in the FLTRB this year, where one teammate was timing it every minute and just waved her hand, waving a finger, so you know where you were in the speech. And how much time spent on each argument depends on the motion, depends on your position. Don't forget about stakeholders. People involved who are impacted by the motion. Stronger arguments if you are able to involve more stakeholders. And if you don't cover them all, you're going to leave a gap for the second team. So be careful. But if you're talking about stakeholders as OG, then OO needs to engage with it. And that's going to take away time from their own prepared arguments. And that's a good strategy. And wasting OO's time is what OG wants to do. Second speakers, you want to matter graph. Do you understand that? You want to use as many arguments as you can, so you leave less room for these second teams to develop anything. But you can't just throw them out as assertions. So hopefully you know this in your preparation. If you're the second team, you've written down anything you can think of that you would like to use. You don't know if you can use anything, because you've got to hear the other house and what they're doing. If they mention something, but it's only an assertion, then you can still use it. If they're using it as a fully developed argument, you can't. Now, if you already know that for your second teams, then you do that in reverse as first teams. So, second speaker, one of the things you're doing when you're taking it further, rather than just repeating the Prime Minister or the leader of the opposition, is you're developing arguments using different stakeholders, for example, so that the second teams have less to work with. Make their job really, really hard, because you are competing against them. It's not just the opposition bench against you, it's the other team as well on your bench. So make it hard. Take stuff away from them. But like I just said, if it's not a fully developed argument, it's a waste of time actually. And I heard that in a final, in a regional final a few months ago. The last minute of the DPM speech, she just listed 80 assertions. But the second team, the opposing government team, was so panicked. Well, we can't use it. Well, you could have done. That it actually worked, but she was lucky because it was just a bad single team. Unfortunately, that day that was my single team. So if it's proven, good. If it's just listing, make sure that you're critically aware of those things, and then you can say that in the second in the OG speech. Can we say we heard the OG talk about blah blah blah? Let me take this further. If there's no explanation, it's a waste of time, as I said. Adequate development, it is always needed in every single argument. So OG, identify the problem, what is the best solution, have your MAD, your model, your agency, your delivery, have something covering principle, obviously try to prove, not just tell, have a team line, and it doesn't say it on the PowerPoint, have a case split as well. So it could be, I've seen plenty of good teams with 3 arguments. 2 for the Prime Minister, 1 for the Deputy. 1 fully developed, convincing argument is all you could need. You don't need 5 that are really developed. And don't forget about the people involved. People are going to be impacted, stakeholders. So I haven't got time to use the other one. The other one was going to be about opposition strategy. So basically, it's covered a little bit here. What it was saying was, don't just use your prepared opposition arguments. You've got to engage with the Prime Minister. There's got to be a comment on the definition or lack of definition. There should be some sort of critical analysis on what the Prime Minister was trying to do before you go into rebuttal. And just a basic speech structure. The first thing you say should not be your argument. It should be this critical comment, the comparative analysis first. Then you should tell us what your arguments are going to be because you've given them names. Then you come to points of rebuttal. And don't do many. Be selective. Rebut the hard thing, not the easy thing to rebut. Rebut the thing that relates to their team stance, not the one thing you know that factually is untrue. This is a trivial point. Who cares? And then spend about 3 minutes doing those things, and then give yourself time to adequately develop the arguments that you had prepared. Or, if the definition is fair and it was the one you didn't expect, you have to think on your feet. And that's just tough. But that will happen. And in big debate, it should happen. Good debaters think on their feet and they're flexible. And for that not to happen to your cost, you just have to know more stuff. So if you go to a debate having read a lot, watched a lot, listened to a lot, with lots of matter, you can adjust more easily. If you've got one narrow take on the debate, and that's not what the Prime Minister said, then you're in trouble. That will happen. Okay? That's it. So if you're in advanced group 1, you stay here. If you're in advanced group 2, you go to F103. it's clear. The whole thing about debate speech, you're speaking to people, they're not clear. So you need to make everything as explicit as possible. So we can give you what it is. It doesn't mean about your own thing.
By your side, yes, and make sure that you support when you
No, no support. But you make comments about support, but no account of the position of first party or first party. Just say that support.
So we're just going to use the sort of practice motions that you probably might already have used. Let me just see what we're doing. So, the goals for this morning, you're going to have some practice on how to brainstorm complex motions. You're going to have some practice on how to select and organise the best arguments. You're going to practice how to learn from other motions. isolated, if you have no evidence for the arguments in this motion, you can use other knowledge from other experience from other motions and make them work. You get practice on trying to find support for arguments, and you will have hopefully basic understanding of the motion, every motion in the session before we finish. Right? And hopefully be discovering good arguments that you can use in more than one motion. If you have a list of prepared arguments that are useful in different areas, it saves a lot of preparation time. So, I need you in pairs. What I'm going to do, I'm going to give you a motion, and I'll give you 10 minutes to think of the best 3 arguments you can come up with. Right, so both of you are going to have the same motion. One of you is going to be in proposition, one of you is going to be in opposition. So, prop, government, opposition. I'm going to give you 10 minutes to prepare. You want 3 arguments. Remember what a Prime Minister is supposed to do. So, what does the Prime Minister do first? Prime Minister first? Before the model. Definitions first. And then, before that, you've got to identify the bloody problem. And then you've got to show how there's a need to fix that problem. Yeah? And then, how do you identify the problem? By talking about how do you identify the problem? Before that, where does the problem exist? In the status quo. So definition, status quo, leading into this is the problem, this is how we need to fix it. Then you model, it's not just model, it's MAD. It's MAD. Then your arguments, and your arguments, the first argument being the best argument to fix the problem. Talk about solvency, talk about how you're solving the problem. LO, first of all, does what? And that could, I didn't say it at all, that could be agreed. We agree with the definition. And it's just easier if you make that clear. Everything that you think could be assumed, you shouldn't think it's assumed at all. So make statements about it, and then we can move on from there. Any team that gives more clarity will get credit. If you're all given equal amount of credit, it gives something else. But if you're making efforts to clarify issues and making everything perfect, to have perfect clarity, better clarity, you get credit. And then opposition. So you've made a comment, you agreed, or you pointed out the deficiency, and then before the rule. Oh, we didn't do it on the PM switch. Yeah. So team stance, case split. That's for PM as well. That's also for LO. And then if you agreed on the definition, what's the debate about? The Prime Minister, remember, the first argument for the Prime Minister is the best argument to fix the problem. So the LO is going to be giving engagement all the time about how that is going to fix the problem, or it's not the best way to fix the problem. Do you want to come in? Obviously not. I'm scary. And then you start running. You don't have to run a counter model. You don't have to do that. You can be arguing in favour of the status quo. But you're going to be making comments, critical comments and arguments based on engagement with what the PM said, as well as arguments that you thought of at the same time. Yeah. That's what we're doing in practice. So.
motion, so if you can write it down. This House would make a failure to render reasonable assistance to a person in distress a criminal offence. This House would make failure to render reasonable assistance to a person in distress a criminal offence. Offence. Can you read it back? Failure. Yeah. To render. You don't write it down, they write it down. You're going to get a different. R-E-N-D-E-R. Reasonable assistance to a person in distress, a criminal offence. So, offence. O-F-F-E-E-N-C-E. So if it's a criminal offence, it would be break the law. So, this House would make failing to act, to render reasonable assistance, to help someone who is in reasonable need of assistance, in reasonable need of help. That's the distress. They need help and they're not being helped. And if you could help and you choose not to help,